Hey guys, welcome to another podcast. I've got a special guest here. Now, this is one of my long-term mentors and friend as well, like Cliff Wilde. Cliff, thanks for coming on the show.
That's my friend. Anytime I can help, right?
Yeah, thanks for being here. I think it came up on memories. Remember that event where I first met you and Marta? It was
Yeah,
December, and it comes out every year, and it's like 2013.
yeah, yeah.
Like that's ridiculous. Like 12 years, well, 11 years coming into the 12th year. So, Cliff, why don't you tell the guys what it is that you do?
Well, it's been an evolution. I guess where I started is not where I am now. And what I do now is I focus on optimization of the human being, and that sounds broad and not specific, but the reality is I've spent 15 years in the trenches, essentially working with chronic health.
Yeah.
Worked with anything from full-blown autoimmune to cancers to helping people have children with six failed rounds of IVF, autoimmune diseases, neurological autoimmune, like a broad selection of chronically ill people that often have been through 10 years of journey, 15 doctors, upwards of 50 to 100 grams in investments, a lot of testing, and just being in a place where they've struggled to see many results that stick. That's really what it comes down to. And, you know, as you all know, Ollie, through my own journey, Marta's journey, for instance, my wife, the reason we got into this was because of those kind of issues. And the reason we now move to optimization, where we work with more people that are suffering with the effect of success. So,
Yeah.
we own a business, you own a business. Um, it takes a level of commitment, energy, focus to make that thing work, right? In a world that, is really stuck with regards to how it looks at, entrepreneurship or whatever it might be. The people that stick out and stuff, they generally, have to put a lot of effort, a lot of responsibility, a lot of restraint into what they do. And as a side effect of that, health very often is a cost,
Yeah.
right? Sleepless nights, all these kind of things. So we work now much more with optimization, whether it's elite athletes, pros, whether it's, CEOs, business owners, entrepreneurs, and really just bringing them back, firstly, to a baseline, because a lot of them don't remember what that's like, right? Everyone associates poor sleep, low mood, all of these kind of things as labels nowadays. It's like, oh, I have bad sleep, I have insomnia, or I have, poor focus, it's ADHD, right? Everything is the next label. And then labels are not exactly empowering for most people. It doesn't mean that things don't exist. It just means that we have a system medically which is highly confusing with regards to labeling. A lot of people in the entrepreneurial space, we see, labeled with things like ADHD and stuff along these lines, but they're going to people that are not specialists in that area. And so we're getting a lot of conflicting issues. And as a side effect of that, to bring it round to optimization, you're ending up with people on drugs that they probably shouldn't be on long term, but are given them in order to help short term, right? Without addressing behaviors or without addressing what might have got them there in the first place. So really nowadays it's a lot more optimization through multiple different disciplines, as you know. And then yeah, that's mainly it.
Uh, Been cool to be able to learn through this period as well, like seeing the changes from you guys. I think the actual seminar we went to, it was all about gut health. There's
Yeah.
a lot more than just working on the gut, right? And I
Mm.
think like we've worked with people together, and something that we've both seen and we've had conversations with it is that people are married to their actual conditions, right? So people aren't necessarily wanting
Mm.
to improve their health. What are you seeing? Like, how do people get past that? Like, they think they want to improve their health, but they're so locked into that condition of ADHD, insomnia, chronic fatigue, or whatever it is. Like, how do people potentially get past that and start to improve?
I think there's a few sides to that coin. The people that are generally successful that I've seen over the last 15 years and working with people in 26 countries now, the people that are generally successful with change are the ones that have that niggly feeling inside that the label doesn't fit.
Mm.
So they've been labeled with, the neurological thing or the, fatigue thing or the syndrome or whatever it might be, right? And I'll just say straight up front, if you've been diagnosed with a syndrome, it's bullshit.
Hmm.
Right. That's what I will say up front, because a syndrome is a collection of symptoms that they can't put you in a box yet,
Yeah.
which means that they just don't have the skills, the testing, the ability to screen at a level to find what your real problem is, if that makes sense. So the people that generally change, the people that I've seen be successful, um, are people that just have this inner level of knowing that it can be different. And they might not know why. Um, and they might have felt like they've lost it a lot along the way, as in like they've given in to things, they've tried things, and they really stick to it. Because entrepreneurs, business owners, people that are high achievers, they are driven. You can't say
Hmm.
they're not driven. You can't say they don't have discipline, right? Because otherwise they wouldn't get to that success. So it's not a
Yeah.
discipline problem. It's a confusion problem because of the overwhelming level of poor information that is out there. You're kind of like needle in a haystack if your problem is a little bit more complex, right? If you're relying on a YouTube video to solve a complex problem, that might give you an initial place to look. But in order to get to the real root of what causes your issue, it's going to probably need a specialist, right? In some way to do that, right? It's completely how, that realm would work. But the problem is obviously when you look at specialists in the conventional realm, there's 152 known specialities in conventional medicine now, and we're the sickest we've ever been. So,
Doesn't add up.
the specialist is probably more multidisciplinary these days than they are neurologist or rheumatologist or gastroenterologist or whichever, subsection of the body that someone's looking at.
Yeah, and I think as well, like we're then getting pushed loads of things from algorithms, from what we've searched for. Like you could have a conversation with someone on WhatsApp, and then suddenly you're getting targeted by these different things, and they're all quick fixes.
Yeah.
And that, like we had a conversation before, like people seem to be chasing the sexy stuff because it's
Mhm.
market like we're seeing marketers getting marketed to and falling for this marketing, and like no doubt when you see a new client and you ask them what supplements they use, and they reel off this list of like loads of different biohacks and things that they're looking at. How do people know if they're focusing on the sexy stuff? I always
Mm.
say that there's 95% and they're the foundations, and a lot of people aren't doing that, but focus on the
Mm.
5%. How do people know what is the right stuff to look at?
And the way I've kind of been explaining it to people recently is it's a bit like an umbrella effect. So, like, if we imagine like we have this kind of like canopy of things, and that canopy is like this protective area of things that really move the needle,
Hmm.
right? And you're underneath it, and it's all raining down on you. So at the time, you feel under pressure. You've got the responsibility of running your business, being financially, certain to, as a business owner, we get stuck in, obviously, we've reached a certain level in life, so we want to maintain that, all of these things, right? So it comes down to a few things. Is that we make poor decisions, which are very immediate gratification because we lack capacity,
Hmm.
right? So this is why people are often picking the short-term gratification that makes them feel better right now, right? Whether it's the Adderall, which God knows how many clients that come to me have put themselves on, right? Or the things along these lines through self-diagnosis online. So I can see why people do it, right? There's no judgment in that. But when you look at the real needle movers, you want to consider for that person, okay, well, what moves the biology, the neurology, what moves the cell function? Like them things are key indicators for me about what someone's doing, right? Because, you know, if you've got, someone that is in a position where, they're staying up till 2 or 3 a.m., right? So they're completely destroying the architecture of their sleep,
Yeah.
right? And so all of us could talk about this architecture of sleep forever. We go through these roughly 90-minute sleep cycles. In your first 4 hours of night, you're going to do, more of your psychological kind of healing, all this physiological stuff where you're going through higher percentage of deep sleep, for instance, so restorative for the body. And then as the night goes on, you get into more length of REM sleep, for instance, rapid eye movement. And if you don't complete enough cycles, yeah, you might feel a bit crappy on the first day, right? But we already see, for instance, if someone had poor sleep for 3 days in a row, their insulin resistance, which is controlling their blood glucose, is 50% less,
Yeah.
right? And so then all of a sudden, it's not the sleep that's just a problem. It's then your ability to control impulses about what food you will and won't consume that day, right? Because you can't send the right signals to be satisfied or any of these kind of things. So, like, sleep, we always talk about sleep, but the architecture of sleep is really it. And I think the personal responsibility of saying, I'm going to be an adult and get up at a certain time and go to bed at a certain time, right? These are things that have been proven a million times, whether look at Matt Walker or you look at other people, for instance, that deal with sleep. No, the studies are not blurry, right?
Mhm.
With regards to poor sleep and all-cause mortality, poor sleep and obesity, poor sleep and cancers, poor sleep and
Hormones
heart
and everything.
disease.
Yeah.
Like, you can just list them. So, my first thing with people is just nailing their sleep. I don't care. I've worked with insomniacs, I've worked with sleep apneas, all these things. You can fix anyone's sleep,
Yep.
but it's really about understanding their behavior of why, because so many people are like, oh, the only time I get to spend time with my partner is in the evenings, for instance. So like I finish work and that, it's like, okay, I understand that. And so how does that get to happen where you're not watching telly for 4 hours?
Yeah.
Because that's not really spending time together. That's vegging out, right?
Yeah.
And it's not to say I don't have a good Netflix marathon or anything like this, but the reality is that if we're doing it every night, it's avoidance. It's not time together, right?
Yeah. And I think as well that I've had people say, "Oh, I have a good routine," and then there's things like that's the only time I get to scroll Instagram and stuff. So
Yeah.
like, so you'd prefer looking at Instagram rather than actually self-love and improving your own health. And another thing I've seen people say is, "I feel good on 5 hours sleep." I've
Mm,
seen it in guys like, and you do their bloods and you
mm,
see their testosterone is tanked. And again,
mm,
like there's a study I often look at, and it's like 6 hours sleep or less for just 2 weeks is going to like lower your testosterone, total testosterone, by
mm.
10 to 15%. And
Yep.
like, I've never seen someone truly be thriving like on regularly on 5 hours or 6 hours sleep when you look deeper into their health.
The mistake they make with that association is because what starts happening after around 5 hours, if they've got blood glucose issues, they're going to start waking up around that time because
Yep.
cortisol is becoming elevated. So what they're essentially feeling is as that cortisol comes up, they've got a lot of stress-based neurotransmitters,
Mhm.
adrenaline, noradrenaline. So of course you're going to feel good,
Yeah. And they get their
right?
best work done at that time in the morning.
Yeah, absolutely. I get it. And that's still from my perspective, from what I've seen just in people over time, does not last. Because what essentially you're doing is you're conditioning the body to live on electricity, because that's what stress-based neurotransmitters are, whether they're coming from the brain, whether they're being released from the adrenals, right? And over time, you'll change the way the HPA axis works, right? The hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. And
Yep.
so therefore, you'll just keep sending all these electronic signals down your spinal column to your adrenals, but the adrenals won't always respond in the same way to create a hormonal response. Because I think what people miss, especially on the early morning stuff, like if they're getting up at 4 a.m. or something like this, what they miss is understanding how systemic the body is. It's not silly in how it signals. So when it sends these signals down from the brain, it wants to follow that signal because that signal is very local, right? So it's either working on neurons in the brain or it's working on, responses in the spinal column, and then it goes out to the periphery. And so when the adrenals get triggered, you're then ideally going to produce a hormonal response, which is systemic. So
Yeah.
it can act on multiple receptors all around the body. So then when you don't have that proper rhythm, or what we would call circadian rhythm, right? Then what happens is that over time, and that time might not be the first month, because if you get up and the first thing you bang is a strong coffee, for instance, right? You'll start noticing maybe I need two stronger coffees,
Yeah.
right? Or maybe it's then three coffees, right? And these things are subtle. People think well, if I don't break in the first week, it's good for me. Right. And that is that whole immediate gratification thing. And so I get it. There's no judgment there. But if we're talking about longevity, which is the thing I care about in people, right? Living the best life, the longest way possible with the least amount of medications, the least amount of inhibition, right? As in for their body, that these things are not optimal.
No. And what about, I'd love to know your thoughts on someone that's stressed out having ice baths.
Yeah. So ice baths are an interesting thing. Like
Yeah.
I get brought this a lot, right, in the entrepreneurial business space. Ice baths and Wim Hof,
Yeah.
right?
Breathing is a big thing we need to look at, but these
Mm.
specific types, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the ice bath first, right?
Yeah.
So when we talk about ice baths, why are people doing it? Most people are doing it to feel better. They want to
Mhm.
feel more alert, right? Everyone has heard when you do an ice bath, depending on what study you read, you'll get an increase of 100 to 200% in dopamine above baseline,
Yeah.
okay? Which feels great, right? Because obviously you're bringing up dopamine, what we probably have to discuss is the different areas of the brain of how that signals. But essentially, you're raising dopamine. But what you're not doing is raising your baseline
Mm.
of
Goes
dopamine.
up,
You're
must come
creating a
down.
spike. So I think what a lot of people miss is understanding that cold exposure could be a couple of times a week, maybe, and that could be really an optimal rhythm for someone. But like if you rely on it and you feel like you have to do it like a Joe Rogan every single day, for instance, my argument is that it isn't the optimal way,
Mm.
right? Because that becomes kind of a reliance to function,
Yep.
right? So what I mean by that is that we mentioned just quickly then about baselines. So dopamine, without getting into complex cycles, essentially dopamine has to recycle and it recycles via something called BH4 into serotonin, right? So that could be complete gobbledygook. But what people have to understand is that dopamine doesn't just come up, go down, and stop, right? So this is your dopamine baseline. Let's say you have an ice bath and you get this surge up here. So as soon as that starts to wear off, it doesn't stop at baseline. It goes down to recover and replenish in order to find balance, right? But the problem we have nowadays is because as soon as we get up, we turn our phone off flight mode, if it's on flight mode, we're looking at notifications, we're looking at stimulus from there, right? So dopamine dominant responses, stress neuron. Then we do the next thing to bring up dopamine. And we keep doing this, right? So the thing is with it is that then we keep not giving our time to replenish dopamine. So therefore, you start becoming serotonin deficient. And
Mm.
how do we know this? Well, look at all the chronic sleep issues that all these people have. And then the second thing is you never feel content.
Yep.
That is the surest sign that serotonin based systems are not working, right? I always say to people, what's the gauge of serotonin? Serotonin is like you can go to bed, you could have a super tough day because serotonin is still a stress based neurotransmitter, but you can be like, you know what, that was a really tough day, but I'm okay.
Mhm.
If you're going to bed and your brain is racing, to do lists, all these kind of things, like some people are self berating themselves what they didn't get done or whatever it might be, like that is a total dysregulation of that neurotransmitter circuitry,
Yep.
right? And so, actually, what would serve that person is actually finding things that would actually reset that baseline rather than it would be push this one harder because you're not feeling good enough.
What sort of things are we looking at?
So for me, it's disconnecting as much as anything. Like for me, when I wake up, my phone is locked for the first 3 hours of the day
Hmm.
because I just know nothing important is going to happen. I'm probably up at around 6-ish a.m., something like that, roughly 6:30. Then for the last 3 hours, 4 hours of my day, from about 6 p.m. to 10, when I go to bed, roughly half 9, 10, my phone is locked as well.
Yep.
Like these are just times that for me, I just know that's not my most productive times. I don't know. I'd rather spend first part of my day with my wife, Marta, training, doing things that get me in a place that builds more resilience than I would pulling stuff away from me. Right.
Yep.
So first thing is not having too much stimulation too early on, too late on. Right. That definitely will make a big difference to how someone feels. The other thing is also doing things that ground you. right, that create connection, whether it's social connection, hanging out with people, because we just spend so much time like this nowadays, right? Whether it is actually being in a position where you spend time, whether it's with your animals or out in nature, walking, like any of these things without electronics,
Yeah.
right, are generally going to be great steps in order just to create some balance. And of course, we can get into more extreme protocols and how to do those things, supplements, foods, all those things. But the reality is, if we can just pigeonhole our day to be, borderline what I would say is a bit more sensible, then the reality is, them things can change. And I haven't found a person yet that can't necessarily work for, if that makes sense. It's just that we're so used to that immediate thing of, social media or Instagram or whatever it might be.
Yeah. So I think it's awareness, as we say, of the dopamine hits we're getting, and then being able to have the discipline to reset, as we say. Now,
Yep.
we wanted to talk about mold, completely change the topic, because that's where we actually look to get you on here. And
Yeah.
I know that I work with a lot of people, like looking at what's going on in their body, and specifically the things that are actually smashing their hormones, which is like hormones are going to be a signal for a lot of people, like something else is going on before them, as we know,
Yep.
looking from a top down approach. And mold is something that we've spoken about so much in the past. So just tell us like your story about mold, that, and then we can say about what signs people are like mold. I think it's a big issue. It's bigger than people think. Like,
Yeah.
what is your story with mold? Tell us a little bit here.
So my story of mold is quite long, but I'll narrow it down. So obviously, you know, within the first 18 years of my life, I nearly died three
We didn't
times.
even touch on that earlier, either,
Right.
did we? So
So that's my history. But so people don't know. And during that time, I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease called ulcerative colitis when I was 15. Okay. So the way to pigeonhole this with mold is to talk about like a resilient spectrum. Okay. So on this side of the resilient spectrum, you have the most resilient people in the world, right? These are your genetically bulletproof people. And while I won't say genetics or everything, or epigenetics, all these kind of things, there is certain patterns that we see that these people live a very long time, regardless of things that they do perceivably that other people couldn't get away with, right?
yeah,
So these are your super resilient people. No symptoms really that are inhibiting their life, no diagnosed diseases. They live well into the 80s, 90s, 100s, right? So then you have the other end of that spectrum, which would be dead, right? So there's no resilience. That person is dead, right? And so we all have to find and have that level of honesty of where we are on that spectrum. And that's really what I speak to clients with, is that for me, right, as someone who's had autoimmune disease diagnosed, brain tumor, scoliosis, kyphosis, major operations, I'm much closer to the dead spectrum than I am this one, right?
you really shouldn't be here with that history.
Pretty much, right? And so, but yet I'm 16 years symptom free of the autoimmune disease this year, right? So, yes, I've pushed myself down here,
Hmm.
but I can't pretend to myself that I can live like this person at this end of the resilient spectrum. There's compromises or sacrifices, we can say, that I have to make in order to keep myself symptom free. So there's no free lunch, right? So when we talk about mold, what we should preface it with is that we know from the data there is about a 20 to 25% part of the population that is hyperreactive to mold. Okay. And we can distinguish between mold and mycotoxins because that's different,
Yeah.
right? So, my story of mold is essentially we moved to Cyprus in 2014, and we were exposed to it before then. I lived in London in an old flat, definitely had mold, and kind of just oblivious to, really the true depth of the issue, if that makes sense. And I can talk to that a bit in a minute. And so we lived in Cyprus. It's extremely humid. Building quality is poor. Mold is very, very common. And so, most people associate mold with like blue or black growing all over the ceilings or wherever it might be, right? And while that is true, that is mold, that isn't the only types of mold, right? There's plenty of hundreds and hundreds of species of mold. And depending on your unique buildup, you might be sensitive to one, but not another, if that makes sense. So it's absolutely possible. And what we have to understand is we are exposed to it all the time. right? But um, the issue with mold is when your tolerance as a human being starts to break down.
Yeah.
Okay, so my tolerance, because of the autoimmune disease history, makes me quite susceptible over time with exposure. So, long story short, we um we were in the UK in 2020, and we were going back to Cyprus to a new place. And so we had a friend who went and looked at all the places for us. And obviously, we gave her all the things to look for, peeling, paint, water
Yeah.
damage stuff, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. Forgetting that she lived in Cyprus and couldn't smell mold if she tried because she lives in it,
Yeah.
right? So basically, she sent us this place. She said it's totally newly refurbished, sent us pictures, everything looked okay, right? So we took that place. Long story short, we went there at the start of March 21, opened the front door, and part of my French, I was like, fuck,
Yeah.
I could smell it. And what do we mean by that smell? So when you get that musty, damp kind of smell, that is mold feeding,
Mm.
because that smell is what we call an MVOC. Okay. So that is how you know mold is there. But the problem is that it's not feeding all the time because there's not always humidity, there's not always moisture unless there's a constant leak. So that's why people think, oh, it's sorted because the smell's gone. That's not necessarily the case. So, like when people are smelling that musty smell, it's definitely there. That just means the mold is physically feeding. That's what the MVOCs are. Um, so basically, what happened to us, we went in there naively. We were like, okay, we'll clean out everything, hydrogen peroxide, all these things that we did to do it. Long story short, within 6 months, I had a neurological seizure. And then, after that, had to finish working with all my consulting clients and take 11 months off because I couldn't sustain function work. I could do an hour call with a client, helping them, and I'd have to take 2 hours to lay down because
Mm.
it felt like my brain was just on fire. And the thing is with it, you have to understand the difference between mold and mycotoxins, because most people, when they think of mold, they think of respiratory issues, right? So they think of wheezing or coughing,
Yeah.
right? Maybe they think of skin rashes, right? Because that's absolutely true as well. But a study from 2006 showed when they found mold sensitive people, they tested them for all of the antibodies. So antibodies are things that the body will produce as part of the immune response. They tested antibodies to all these different things, from respiratory stuff to memory to fatigue to all these kind of things. And they measured it against controls. Okay. So like respiratory, for instance, 60% of people that were sensitized, they have respiratory symptoms, right? So people are like, wow, that's pretty high. And I'm like, but 100% of people that were tested had immune responses to the nervous system.
Wow.
So when we see people with chronic anxieties, when we see panic attacks, when we see anxieties, when we see like the inability to calm down, like just this a real ache inside from a point of view of stop, start in life, there's 100% of people that had reactions to the nervous system, what we call myelin basic proteins. And that is part of the sheath of your nervous system. So essentially, the way that mechanism works is twofold. You can inhale toxins or mycotoxins or mold spores through your nose, right? And we have immune cells in the nose, but at the top of the nose, you have the olfactory nerves, right? So most people would have heard of the olfactory because of COVID, because it's all to do with smell and taste and things along those lines. But the olfactory nerves, what they do is they communicate directly to the brain, right?
Yeah.
So what happens is people inhale these things, is they're sensitized, which happens. We can talk about how tolerance breaks down, but as they become sensitized, that signals straight to the brain, right? So then when you were talking about hormones, the next bit makes sense because we actually can take in mold spores via our mouth and via our food, right? If someone's eating a fair amount of grains or if people are eating a fair amount of processed foods, you're generally going to find higher levels of mold on those foods. So when we swallow them, right? And so we have a huge amount of the immune system in or around the gut. So really should protect us.
I think
But
like just on that note as well, it doesn't
yeah,
have to be food that's gone off.
no, 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 no.
Yeah.
It could be just poor storage of grains.
Yeah.
So it is not to vilify grains by any means. This happens in coffee, anything that is produced, farmed, and then stored for a while.
Yeah.
Like if it's stored in a place that has high humidity, or if it's stored in a place, for instance, that, the bags are permeable, whatever it might be. Like that's what it is. And it is not to scare people and say all these things are wrong, but it's about understanding the physiology of how we miss things.
Hmm.
Right? That's really what it's about. And so when we inhale it through our mouth, obviously, if you still have your tonsils, there's immune cells on them tonsils, right? So that's going to raise a signal that the body is like, okay, we need to deal with this. So you would deal with it naturally on the way down. But if you're someone that is taking in a lot because you live in a home that has mold, you're going to be inhaling a lot more than someone who doesn't, right? If they're
Yeah.
just taking it in through food. So the problem with that, when you were talking about hormones, is that we know, for instance, mold spores or mycotoxins. So mycotoxins are the defense mechanism for mold. So they're not directly made from mold; they're made as a byproduct, essentially. And so mycotoxins become higher at higher levels when different molds are present and they're competing. So the mycotoxins are like a defense mechanism. But I'll give you an example. Not everyone has issues with mold toxicity, but every human is sensitive to mycotoxins.
Hmm.
Okay, so that's the difference. So everyone will be like, well, I don't think I have an issue with mold. But if you're taking in something that has mold, that could be okay for you. You might be resilient. But if there's mycotoxins attached to that, for instance, that person will be having some negative outcome because of it, if that makes sense. So
Absolutely.
like that's the differentiation.
So how are people going to be able, like, I know some tests and stuff like that, but is there a test that's going to look for all of these things? Because I know there's
Mm.
mycotoxin tests, there's air quality tests. Like,
Mm.
how are you able to see this with clients apart from the symptoms? Like, we can see symptomology, like it's second nature to us.
Mm.
But how can people be like, I need to test this?
Yeah, absolutely. The honest answer is that there isn't one perfect test.
No.
If you're doing one test, and I can list all the tests, I think, as a great resource, I'm always open to sharing what I can. There's a website, a charity called changetheairfoundation.org. And they have loads and loads and loads and loads of resources on there with regards to different types of tests, the benefits, the pros, the cons, because it's like anything, even in functional medicine or any of these things, no test is perfect.
No.
You need to know how to use it, when to use it. So when we look at testing, we have air quality tests, right? So we can do an air test, which very often involves putting something in the middle of the room for a period of time. It collects a reading, and then you send that off in order to basically see what the results are. So when we look at the data of air testing, they've basically shown that if, for instance, you are in a place where there's no mold, let's say 3, 4 feet away in the wall, air testing will miss it 60% of the time.
Wow.
Because the thing is with it, unless something is vaporized and it's in the air and it has some level of ability to move around, it becomes an issue to detect with air testing. So you get a lot of false positives, a lot of false negatives mainly through air testing,
Yep.
right? So then what else do we have? We have ERMI, which is an environmental relative mold index, if that makes sense. And so that's like a DNA sequencing test. Okay, it looks for 35 toxigenic, non-toxigenic molds. Um, and basically, it's the original version of it used to do with a Hoover. So you would get, because mold is very attached to things like carpets, it settles in carpets, it proliferates in carpets, old carpets really well. So what they used to do is they used to have this sheet, for instance, you'd have the Hoover nozzle and you would suck basically onto it, right? And so that was a bit of a pain. So what they developed it to was like a Swiffer. So you get these little cloths now, lint cloths, really, and you can basically take a Swiffer of all different areas. So you would take it off a skirting board, you would take it off the top of the fridge, you would take it off areas that you're not really off the top of the door frames, right? You
Hmm.
wouldn't take it from known mold spot places because you know mold is there,
Yeah.
right? So in an ideal world, obviously it's not the cheapest test in the world, but in an ideal world, you would test every room separate. But if you wanted to know whether you just had exposure to toxigenic molds, that test would give you an idea that it's definitely been there in the past, right? Because it's a retrospective test, really, when you think about it. It's in dust
Yep.
because mold and dust go hand in hand, right? So you can test that dust. And for instance, there's lots of people who don't like that test, lots of people who do like it. But for me, as an entry point for not too expensive, because like it gets very expensive if there's a problem, right? For remediation, all this kind of stuff. Like that is probably a good place to do it. They're in America, they have something called the dust test, which is a similar thing, really. We have Emma. Emma is a mycotoxin specific test, for instance. So if I've got someone who I know has mold sensitivity, I'm going to be very worried about the mycotoxins they're exposed to,
Okay.
right? Because I just know that that's holding them back. As where, for instance, you could have certain people that have low levels of mycotoxins, but they have molds, right? And that is the thing for them. So you have air testing, you have the ERMI test, for instance, you have the dust test, you have the test with regards to things along those lines. And what I would say is it really depends. You could go down the route then of more invasive testing. So, like invasive testing from a point of view that you go into the wall.
Okay.
Because the reason you'd go into the wall is if you use like a thermal imaging camera in the walls, you can see cold and hot patches,
Yeah.
right? And when you start seeing cold patches in the wall, you can then take a moisture measurement. So if you get a damp meter, you could get for maybe $50 or £50, you can start measuring moisture levels within bricks or within plaster or whatever it might be, and they should be at specific levels. So if you start getting elevated readings, like I've just had a client who was worried about it, and I said, look, just use your damp meter and look, and he's got 20% readings in his wall. I'm like, there's moisture there.
What
That
would
isn't
we
a
be looking
normal
at?
reading.
What would a normal reading be?
So clinically, if you look at all the places, depending on if it's brick or if it's plaster, it's going to be different. But essentially, if plaster is less than 12 to 14%, they're going to say it's fine,
And
right?
optimal?
A
Well,
few,
optimal would be like pretty much minimal, right?
well, minimal, yeah, a couple of percent maybe, because
Yeah.
there's always going to be some residual
Yeah,
moisture,
there's gonna be
right,
something there,
within
yeah.
anything. It's always it. But if you've got a bit of a wall, let's say, and you measure and there's 2%, 2%, 2%, 2%, and you get to this end of the wall and it's 10,
Yeah.
that's not consistent across the whole wall, right? It
No.
should all be very, very similar. So you'd want to understand maybe why that's an issue, because how things are built nowadays creates some of the problems, right?
Mhm.
Because everything is tried to be as sealed as possible. Like it's how you get your energy efficiency rating, all these kind of things, all the paints, the things we use, VOCs, they kind of all come together to essentially cause a bit of an issue for people. So there's lots of different ways to test, but really I would just say like, using something like an ERMI, some way of checking like a HVAC system, because they are riddled normally if they're not looked at properly, and not even in the vents because people get them clean maybe every year, but the physical generator
Mhm.
that's recycling the air and everything, that's the thing to really check that I see
Okay.
people miss all the time.
So how would people, and this is going to be obviously different based on every individual, like any cookie cutter protocol is going to be very hard to actually get to the individual. But just generally, if people know they've got mold and it's saturated their tissues and stuff, how would they work
Mm.
on kind of detoxifying and improving? I know that one of the answers people aren't going to like of just you might need to move.
Yeah, it really depends on the level of the issue. Because remediation, I'll give you an idea. Like functional medicine, the mold industry is mostly cowboys,
Yep.
right? And I don't mean that in a horrible way, but I mean it from a way of results. Like you can become a categorized mold remediation expert at a 3-day course for $1,000,
Wow.
right? You are not like, I'll give you an example. We had an issue at one of our places. There was a sewage leak underneath the house via blah blah blah. So the guy was like really really willing to help. the owner. So he was like, yeah, don't worry, we'll bring dryers in and all these kind of things. I was like, that's great, perfect. But I was like, that's not good enough for us. Because I said, when you dry out these, because we haven't gotten to bacterias, Actinomyces and stuff like
This could
this.
be like a 4 hour podcast if we,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. I would avoid that bit. But basically, what happens is when you dry it, it fragments. And even on the WHO's website, and the WHO are not the best people in the world, but on the World Health Organization website, they will tell you that fragmented mold is 40 times more toxic to humans when it gets airborne.
wow,
So you can have someone that comes in and dries, but if them dryers are then circulate in the air around the house, you can just essentially fill up all the other rooms that weren't a problem already with issues. And then it gets into furniture and all these kind of things. So the reality is, A, you need someone who really knows what they're doing. In the UK, I know of one person that runs a company that does that. It's called buildingforensics.co.uk. He is 30 years experience, unbelievably knowledgeable, unbelievably useful at what he does. I've had a few clients that have used him. In the US, there's a couple of people, but I don't always use names because they change depending on how they perform. So there are a few people, but you just have to be really mindful.
mhm,
I would say, if you've got a wall that is covered, that is probably going to cost you more money than it would to move,
yeah,
right? The resistance is for a lot of people, obviously, if you've got a family home or you've got, been there a long period of time, I totally get it.
yeah, I understand it.
Understand it. But the biggest red flag that you've got issues with mold is when you leave that home, you feel better.
Yeah,
That is the biggest red flag. Like if you've got constant skin issues, if you've got constant neurological, anxiety issues, you don't feel settled, we always associate going on holiday and getting sick or feeling better or whatever it might be with de-stressing or stress coming out of our system. It might be, but it is also, I see a lot in clients that they've got issues. I had one client who, for instance, she was in New Zealand. She, for 10 years, had been working with practitioners for ADHD-like symptoms, depression, anxiety, skin issues, inability to lose weight. And she came to me and she said, look, I want your help here. I've been recommended to you, blah, blah, blah. And I said, that's great. I looked through all of her files, all of her data. I said, you have done everything nearly. I said, you haven't tested for some of the things I would test, but you've done enough that everything you should have done should have got some results.
yeah,
So I said, either you have to be honest, either you didn't do this stuff, which wasn't true. She was very, very committed, or you've missed something. So I said to her, knowing that you live in New Zealand, 70% of them homes are water damaged and they're all made from wood. I said, I test your home because I said, I wouldn't feel good about taking money off you if we find out it's your home. Right. So she tested her home. It was one of the worst scores I'd ever seen.
wow,
And so I just said to her, I was like, look, save your money. Here are some supplements to help offset, because there are some things we can do when we live in mold and all those kind of things to offset and can talk about that. But I said, take these as a minimum, but stop spending money on practitioners and all these kind of things unless there's no way she's remediating that place. Like you'd burn it down
yeah,
for sure. Like you just need to move somewhere else. Right. So I just said, from my perspective, focus on this. And then that would be it. You just have to be honest. Does that make sense?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I'm aware of the time and everything like that, but we covered a lot on mold and like people looking at the dopamine release and everything like that. But if you were to look back over clients over the last 10, 15 years, however long it's been, what are three things that could really like you see people not doing that they could do to really improve their health, just generally?
Yeah, 100%. Sleep.
Yep.
Like, I just sleep is
Yeah.
honestly, I don't even know how to make it any more important. Like people think they sleep, but I would say to everybody, probably go and do some form of sleep study
Hmm.
and actually just see the quality of your sleep. You'll probably be shocked.
Yeah.
Because most people mouth breathe, for instance, when they sleep. So they've got issues, especially if you've got like loads of cavities, mouth oral microbiome issues, root canals. Like this is constant mouth breathing, right? For sure. So sleep would absolutely be it. The second thing would be obviously making sure that your home environment is as conducive to good health as possible.
Hmm.
And the third thing, and this is probably not talked about enough, is understand your tolerance
Yeah.
to the world. So there's three levels of tolerance, and I'll do it really quickly. The first level of tolerance is oral tolerance, right? So oral tolerance is your body's ability to tell the difference between what you eat and ingest, what is safe and what is not. So how do we know we've lost oral tolerance? You're reacting to all the foods. You've got airborne allergies, you've got dust allergies, you've got you've lost oral tolerance. Okay, so oral tolerance. That's an immune issue, a microbiome issue. The second level of tolerance, which people suffer with autoimmune, is central tolerance.
Okay.
Okay, so central tolerance is when you make immune cells from the bone marrow, they go to the thymus. It's like immune cells go to school when they go to the thymus, right? So it's like they're being trained not to be reactive to their own body tissues. So then they get sent out into the body to make sure everything is okay. So when you get a dysregulated central tolerance, autoimmune becomes the issue risk for people.
Okay.
So if you've got family history of autoimmune, that is something you really need to pay attention to. But because the body is clever, there's a third level of tolerance called peripheral tolerance. So even if the first two get messed up, you have the third one, which is mainly regulated by what we call T regulatory cells, which basically tells the immune system, do this, don't do this. This is my body. This is not my body. Go and do this. So when the peripheral tolerance gets messed up, this is when we've lost tolerance across the body. And therefore, we have a very difficult time telling the difference between mold is a bad problem or that tissue, like I spoke about, 100% of people that had mold sensitivities have issues with nervous system. The reason for that is because the proteins of certain mold, like aspergillus, match the proteins, the building match the nervous system 90%. So the body gets confused. So if you've lost tolerance, it'll attack the body and the mold. And that's the same for food. That's the same for, allergies, air allergies, all these things. So actually, if you can get to understand your tolerance and improve that, that's probably the biggest needle shifter I see in people.
Yeah, that'll be powerful. That'll be powerful. Well, Cliff, thanks for your time. If people want to contact you, they're worried about the deeper things going on with their health and looking for optimization. How can they do that?
Super simple. You can just go to cliffandmarta.com. Um, and yeah, I'm on Facebook. So just search my name. I generally post stuff on there.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate the time.
Thanks, buddy. Thanks for having me.